We'll wait for that. Great. All right. Well, now that the video has started, let's go ahead and can get this presentation going. So first I'm going to hit a lot of buttons on my end to be able to share the presentation. One moment. Okay. Let's see, there is share screen. Okay. Are folks able to see the presentation? Great. All right. Cool. Well, then let's get started. So we're going to start off by talking about the early history of the disability rights movement, sort of like why it formed, what it was trying to do, and then the divergence into the disability justice movement later on. We're going to talk a lot about the different sort of kinds of disabilities out there, and how that impacts how those of us with disabilities are treated by non-disabled people. We're going to talk a little about like respectful language, how to know like what are the right words that you could use to, refer to like people with disabilities, might be whether it be like person with a disability, disabled person, differently abled, specially abled, exceptionally abled, yada, yada, yada. We'll talk about all that. And then we'll end with probably one of my favorite parts, which is the models of disability, which is just going over sort of like the zoomed out societal views of like, asking like, why does disability happen? What does success mean for people with disabilities? And, what kind of supports do we need? And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of cool things throughout this presentation as well. So really quickly, Jay and I both work for an organization called the Arc of King County. We have existed since as far as something like 1937, 1938. We're one of the oldest continuously operating nonprofits in King County. Our mission is to essentially ensure that people with disabilities can, have a good life, and, take for granted the same choices that non-disabled people are able to take for granted on a daily basis. We are a relatively large nonprofit. We've got about 200 employees. Jay and I both work in the information and outreach side of things, where we show up to places like this, give presentations, and then we also help people navigate the really, really confusing service system out there. So, if you or anyone in your family or someone you're connected to has a disability, whether it be a developmental or like intellectual disability or any other kind of disability, you can call us at 206-829-7053 or email us at ask@arcofkingcounty.org, and we will do our best to assist y'all with anything that pops up. Cool. Well, now that all that's out of the way, let's actually jump into the presentation. And again, like, feel free to let us know if you have questions, either by typing it in chat or raising your hand in the reaction tab. So Jay's going to start off by talking a little about like why the disability rights movement exists, like what it did, and what some of the continuing impacts have been. So take it away, Jay.
So many people do not realize that disability rights are civil rights. The purpose of this training is to help you begin to understand how people think about disability and how it affects our civil rights. We want you to leave today with new awareness, even if it is a little thing, so that you are better educated and hopefully you can share this with other people. In 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was passed to promote civil rights from the federal legislation and ensure equal opportunities for people with disabilities to be successful in their lives. This law excludes discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places in the community. The AD does a pretty good job of creating accessible spaces for people with physical disabilities, but not all kinds of disabilities. It does not accommodate people with sensory issues very well, for example. Also, current policymakers are trying to cut out the AD because it costs too much money and they do not think it is needed. Because of it, people are not encouraged and feel unsafe. The more people talk about this, we can have better outcomes. I think that the disability civil rights movement is really important to talk about because while it has become a long way and we have to keep discuss about it to make improvements. While we talk about racism, gender, otherism, we leave out disabilities in the conversation. People with disabilities are most likely to drop out of high school and cannot get higher education or have a job. I think about 35% of people with disabilities are homeless, but I am sure that the number is higher. People with disabilities have so much higher rate of being sexual abuse than other people. We just do not think about the disability rights and do not realize how much people are affected by it. As you see, this is not a one-time fixed type of problem. We have to keep bringing this up to the table and advocate.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, definitely a lot to reflect on and marinate there on with what you just said there. I think the one thing that really pops up to mind is, yeah, we really do have to spend so much energy advocating as people with disabilities, and that's really something that most folks out there aren't usually aware of. And it's everything from advocating for ourselves in like the school systems when we're trying to get accommodations, either as like, people in high school or, in college or university, to, advocating for like where we live, who we spend time with, who our friends are, what we have for dinner, to, like advocating for accommodations at jobs. And that all of that takes a lot of energy. So, it's just one way that, we're not necessarily operating at the same level as everyone else. And it's, not only because we have a disability, it's also because, the way the world is set up isn't necessarily set up assuming that there's going to be people like Jay or I, living here. And, thinking about like the early history of the disability rights movement, it formed back, I think it was around the 1960s, when it really started forming. And probably the events it was most known for, first was the transit sit-ins. So back in the day, like cities like Denver and Chicago, they had public transit systems, but they didn't really have public transit systems that had like wheelchair ramps or elevators or, other sort of like ways to accommodate people with physical disabilities. And so it took disabled activists about 5 years of protesting before, the public transit systems were able to, the transit systems finally agreed to actually think about accessibility and, implement, things like those wheelchair ramps or elevators. And even still today, it still feels like we're fighting the same fight. Probably like one of the, thinking of like all of my friends who use wheelchairs or have physical disabilities, one of their favorite things to do is just to complain about the fact that, say, the elevators at the light rail stations always seem to break down. And as someone who occasionally rides the light rail, I have also noticed this. And for me, like, I can walk on two legs just fine. I can just use the escalators or stairs. But if you can't, then it means you might have to go down a stop, 2 stops before you can, like, say you can get to a bus line that can finally take you back to where you need to go. And who knows how much time that's going to take. That's something you're not necessarily going to plan for. So that's just another way that like people with disabilities are still spending a lot of energy just to exist. In an inaccessible world. And it could be all the more fraud if, like, hey, you're trying to get to a really important meeting, at work or, at the doctor's office, or trying to get Social Security. It's pretty fraught. And Social Security is also a really important thing to talk about, because probably the event that the disability rights movement is most known for is the 504 sit-ins. So back in, oh man, I forgot the specific year. I think it was like 1977, 1978. The Secretary of Housing, Education, and Welfare refused to implement the 504 laws, which required federal buildings to be physically accessible to people with disabilities. And like, that's a big deal because these buildings control things like Medicaid, Social Security, you know, other sort of like life-sustaining benefits that people with disabilities will need to depend on to survive in the world. And so because of the refusal to implement those standards, activists across 30 different cities continuously occupied their local federal buildings. The one in San Francisco was occupied for, I think it was about 27 straight days before the Secretary of Housing, Education, and Welfare agreed to implement the 504 laws. And like, this was a pretty big deal. It wouldn't have been possible, without the support of like local organizations like churches, community groups, news organizations, and the Black Panthers. And I specifically bring up the Black Panthers because, as Jay brought up earlier, the disability rights movement has often been criticized for only taking a single issue focus. It only looks at disability, through the lens of disability. And it also takes a very sort of like legalistic focus. It tries to modify existing systems to be more accessible, which, I mean, sure, on the surface of it, it sounds great. Like, more accessibility, that's good for everyone. But, thinking of the various different institutions that operate in the world, like, there are disparate impacts for, folks of color who have disabilities. My experience as a white autistic dude is going to be a lot different than a Black autistic woman. And, in terms of thinking about like, how do we do organizing, you really need to consider intersectionality. So because of this, the disability rights movement sort of, they in a lot of ways failed to address these critiques. And so the disability justice movement formed as a sort of like separate advocacy force back in the early 2000s, spearheaded by, BIPOC disabled folks, led by folks like, Leroy Moore, Mia Mungus, Leah, I always forget how to pronounce her last name. It's something like Lakshmi, something close to that. And they've come up with, probably one of the most profound, sort of like philosophical documents that exists in this work, called The 10 Principles of Disability Justice. And I know, like, there's a lot of words on the screen, and a lot of like context and nuance behind these words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through these principles and explain a little more about what they mean, why they exist. And then after, I'd love to have a conversation with the folks in the audience, just hearing like, which of these principles really, really speaks to you in your life? And, why is that? So I'm going to start with the first, and I think it's, very telling that it is the first. It's intersectionality. Just the idea that, like, my experience as a white autistic dude will be different than a Black autistic woman. And when you're considering like disability advocacy, you really need to consider all the forms of intersectionality out there, like, sexual orientation, gender, country of origin, along with all of the other like super important ones. This next one is leadership of the most impacted. And for me, it's probably one of the most profound. It's just the idea that, those who face the most oppression, the most marginalization from the system that we exist in, are going to be the ones who have the strongest insight on like what needs to change in order to fix these systems or create new systems that, aren't as burdened by, oppressive forces that exist in the current ones. Number 3 is anti-capitalist politic. And I would say it's probably another cornerstone of these 10 principles. It's just reflecting on the idea that, like, in a lot of ways, like, capitalism has big implications on like who we see as, who we see as a human being, how valuable we think a life is worth living, how valuable we think a life is to society, and, who gets left behind in those determinations, and we'll talk about this one a lot more in a future slide. Number 4 is commitment to cross-movement organizing, and that's just essentially reflecting on the idea that like liberation of one group, like disabled people, can't happen without the liberation of like all the groups out there. And similar to like intersectionality, you really need to be informed and aware of like what other marginalized groups are encountering, and seeing how all of the different forms of oppression out there are interlinked in a lot of different ways. Number 5 is recognizing wholeness, and that's very, very similar to number 3. It's just recognizing that we're worth so much more than what we produce for the economy. And everyone's life has nuance, meaning, and value. And oftentimes, that same, all of those things aren't given to people with disabilities. Number 6 is sustainability, and that's just reflecting on the idea that like these systems weren't built in a day. They were built over many lifetimes by many people. And because of that, like as one of my friends says, like this isn't a sprint, this is a relay race. We got to support one another, and we can't burn ourselves out because the systems are set up in a way to burn us out when we're doing advocacy like this. Number 7 is commitment to cross-disability solidarity, and that's very similar to number 4. It's just recognizing like the things that impact people with physical disabilities could potentially be different than like what impacts autistic folks, or people with ADHD, or like people with brain injuries. But the same, all of the forms of oppression out there all come from the same root causes, and we have to work with one another to be able to address those causes. Number 8 is interdependence, and that's really just looking at like, oftentimes the main goal that the systems we work in assign people with disabilities is independence, being completely separated from other people. And while sure, there could definitely be some value in that, it's also pushed on people with disabilities to a degree that is often harmful to everyone involved. We're all human beings. We've been able to do the things we do because we support one another, and we shouldn't have a double standard when it comes to people with disabilities. Number 9 is collective access. And if you've read the book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, it does a great job at really describing collective access. It's just looking at what are like the different ways that like people with very complex, multiply marginalized identities show up in the world. How do we respect and celebrate and nurture all of those different ways? How do we find joy and meaning in and fulfillment in those ways? And how do we see value in those different experiences? And how do we use those different experiences in a way that will solve problems for everyone, not just folks with disabilities? And number 10 is collective liberation, which is essentially just the idea that like we can't leave anyone behind in this work. The liberation of one can't happen without the liberation of all, and we got to support one another through this work. So I just said a lot of words there. I'm going to give folks a moment to think about like which of these really speak to you. I'm going to take a drink of water. Once that's done, I'd love to hear from folks, either typing in chat, or you can take yourself off mute and share what you're thinking on this, like which of these really speak to you. So Kayla wrote in chat that Kayla really loves number 1, intersectionality, in that it's reflected throughout and it guides all of them. I absolutely agree. I think intersectionality, I mean, I don't want to say any of them are more important than others, but I think it is absolutely at the foundation of pretty much all of these. It's the reason why the disability justice movement exists. So it is a really powerful one for sure. What do other folks think? I think for me, leadership of the most impacted is probably one of the most profound in terms of how I do this work. It's just looking at, how do we make sure those who are the most marginalized, who fall in the cracks the most, are the ones who are actually leading these movements and the change work. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of focus, but it, I think, is probably one of the most critical in terms of making sure this work is being done in the right way. Julie in chat writes, can we elaborate on number 8? Yeah, so that's really just looking at, realizing that as human beings, we're connected to one another in very strong and vibrant ways. And oftentimes, the idea of independence is seen as the be all end all goal for people with disabilities in this, in the United States specifically. And it's often done at a very unhealthy and ultimately harmful level. And Jay and I will talk a lot about that later on in this presentation, but it's just reflecting on the idea that, not needing to rely on supports from others maybe isn't the, greatest goal for people with disabilities. I would say it's, finding meaning and happiness and fulfillment and enjoyment. And, we need other people to be able to do that usually. Hopefully that helps, and let us know if you have any further questions on that. Suni wrote in chat that she really loves number 3 and 5, the connection of how people are valued to take from ourselves commodities to whole beings. Yeah, that's a very poignant and powerful thought there, and absolutely one that's, I would say, at the cornerstone of the disability justice movement. Constance wrote, recognizing wholeness gets at the to the heart of our tendencies to judge and compete one another. Such an important thing to address. Yeah, we do live in a very competitive society, for good or ill, and that definitely has differing impacts on folks, and oftentimes will leave many people with disabilities out, for sure. Do folks have any other thoughts or ideas before? Julie wrote, I think in order for us to have leaders, we need to have more people with disabilities in college. We are the least likely to attend higher ed. Yeah, absolutely. I was, Julie, I'm not sure if you saw the talk by Alice Wong last night over at UW, but she was talking a lot about that and just how the way academia is set up is not in a way that is conducive to the existence of people with disabilities. And yeah, Jay and I have stories on that. Jay has a lot of stories on that, actually. Cool. Well, I really appreciate the thoughts and ideas that y'all have shared so far. Are there any others before we jump to the next slide? Okay, doesn't seem like it. So yeah, I appreciate everything y'all have said so far. Please keep the thoughts coming, and we're going to start talking about what are the contemporary issues that people with disabilities are encountering, and how have the institutions impacted us. So take it away, Jay.
Many cultures have struggled to accept disabilities for most of our history. People with disabilities have been killed, imprisoned, sterilized, and hidden from society. Doctors advise families to put a newborn baby with Down syndrome or other disabilities into an institution as recent as the 1970s. Back then, people did not know about disabilities, and they instead decided to exclude those children from the society. So children basically were locked out and had no connections with the community or their families. It wasn't until the single point 70s that children with disabilities had the right to attend public schools. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, stating that discrimination against someone because of their disability violates their civil rights. Now, children with disabilities can go to school and receive support to reach their goals. However, we still have 4 institutions for people with IDD in Washington state despite the national trend to eliminate institutional care in order to provide community-based care. This ties to eugenics, which is basically sterilization of people with disabilities. People of color could not come to the U.S. because of their physical appearances that were considered like disabilities. This is similar to the ugly law that basically said people who look different from everyone else, they should be separated from the society. People were afraid that disabilities might get passed on to the next generation. As we can see, our history and science have been influenced how we view disabilities. Even though we know better about disability now, we still tend to segregate people with disabilities through special education classrooms, employment, etc. We would love to see that people with disabilities living in the community with their family and friends and still receive all the support they need. We all have biases about disabilities from our history. Did you see students with disabilities in a class when you were young? Special education law is only a little over 30 years old if I did the math correctly. We still have a long way to go.
Yeah, we do have a really long way to go. And yeah, it's just interesting to think that, like, I'm pretty much as old as the Americans with Disabilities Act was, and we have made a lot of improvements since then, and there's still a very long way to go. A recurring theme you'll hear through this presentation is that disability, there's disparate impacts on things like the Americans with Disabilities Act on people with disabilities. And a lot of that comes down to, how our disability shows up to other people, which we'll talk about in the next slide. A lot of it also comes down to, how easy is it for us to access the protection that, like, the ADA affords us, for example. When you're encountering employment discrimination, oftentimes the only recourse you might have is to hire a lawyer to advocate for you. And considering the fact that, for instance, 80% of autistic people are unemployed, according to a lot of studies that are out there, means, a lot of us may not necessarily have the funds to be able to hire a lawyer if we are lucky enough to find a job. It also means that, for instance, for a lot of folks, if they're receiving supplemental security income, they are only able to have, about $2,000 in the bank, before their, essentially life-sustaining benefits are going to be cut off. And so, oftentimes legal recourses are not always available to us because, of a lack of access. And thinking about another big thing that Jay just talked about there, she was talking about the institutions. So, historically back in the 1920s, 1930s, the government decided that, it would support families of people with disabilities by moving them to specially built schools to essentially educate people with disabilities to act more normal, so that will be, more acceptable to society. Unfortunately, that didn't work. People with disabilities still were not accepted by people without disabilities. And so then these schools became large scale, government-run institutions that essentially just ended up being a place to warehouse people with disabilities, hide us away from society, out of sight, out of mind of, the non-disabled people, so they didn't have to be made uncomfortable by our existence. And what ended up happening, as you can see in these pictures at the top left here, these became really abusive, horrible places to live. At best, in many of these places, you might just be wheeled out into the hallway or a day room and just left there every day without any sort of entertainment or enrichment. At worst, you might be bullied or abused by other people living there or by staff members. At worst, like the lack of care may have ended up killing you. There were a lot of circumstances where like someone with a complex motor or swallowing disability were only able to be fed like maybe 5 minutes a day because of the low staff ratios. And so a lot of folks like that either ended up like suffocating to death because they ate their food too much, too quickly, or they just starved from the lack of nutrition that they were provided. So because of all the abuse and those deaths, the government then decided that people with disabilities would be better served living in the community with our friends and family members, which I absolutely agree with. I think that's the right way to go. The big problem, though, is there's also a lot of funding need to make sure that happens. And so like starting off, the deinstitutionalization movement really made a lot of great strides. Like there were a lot more community, based services that were created for people with disabilities who were living in those institutions. The Arc of King County in a lot of ways is one of them. We house about 50 people who are enrolled in the state's developmental disability housing waiver program. And so, things were going well. But then I believe it was the Reagan administration then made the decision that the sort of those who should take charge of deinstitutionalization, the Reagan administration decided that it would be the state who takes charge, not the federal government, which had the funding or expertise. And so as a result, a lot of institutions just ended up kicking people with disabilities right off into the streets without any connecting resources or homes to move into or any sort of supports. One thing Jay had mentioned earlier is that like there's a lot of people with disabilities who are homeless, and the way the deinstitutionalization movement ended up is a cause of that. A lot of Black and brown folks with disabilities often end up homeless and are often criminalized for their behaviors related to disabilities. And now as a result, like jails and prisons are now like the largest service providers of people with disabilities in the country. And I would say the vast majority of people, like myself, would agree that that is not the ideal circumstance. And, we need to better support people with disabilities out there. Unfortunately, right now, Washington, for instance, is 42nd out of 50th per capita in terms of developmental disability funding. New Mexico, for instance, spends about 3 times as much per person with a disability as we do. And so, unfortunately, that leads to a lot of really dire and deadly situations for those of us with developmental disabilities in the state. And something, we're still trying to address. Do folks have any questions on any of this? Can you comment on the effectiveness and or failure of group homes? We have a lot of them in Shoreline. That is a great question. I would say, first, as I just mentioned, Washington State is horrible at providing funding. A big way that's reflected is, the low wages that are provided to people who are running those group homes. So as results, like standards of care may not often be the best at those places. They might still be better than what you get at an institution, but it still, wouldn't be enough to have a good, happy life. So as a result, there's a very high caregiving shortage. There's a lot of people who want to move out of the institutions and can't because, the way that these group homes are reimbursed are not, it's not done in a way that actually provides people the supports they need. There are other group homes like, that do a really great job and, are absolutely, great, wonderful places to live. There are also a lot that aren't, and not necessarily because of, a lack of trying. It's just, it's very difficult to be able to run good supportive group homes in the state currently. And that's, the Arc of King County also has a legislative advocacy department of about 3 people. And this is like one of the main things we've been addressing like year after year for the past like 20, 30 years. Yeah, so Kayla, like that is, asking about like funding, that's a great question. In my personal opinion, the reason why this is happening is that Washington State does not have an income tax. We have one of the most like regressive tax systems in the country. And that means, there just isn't enough, because of that, there just isn't enough funding available to address the needs that are out there. Oftentimes, cities and, counties have to rely on like sales taxes or property taxes to make up for the shortfall. And it's not necessarily possible to really be able to, first do the planning and provide the supports needed on a large scale basis for things like, group homes or homelessness services or, all the, even like community mental health services as well. So, that's my opinion. I'm not sure if that's an official opinion from the Arc of King County, but, that's how I see it. Jay says, talk about this more. Jay, are you saying I should talk about this more right now? No, or, oh, that's your answer to, Kayla. Yes, that's a great answer. And I agree with you. It's just that, yeah, a lot of folks just aren't aware of things like this, and bringing up these issues, like, wherever you can is a really good idea. You can also reach out to the Arc of King County if you're looking for like specific ways to advocate. And we often send out advocacy alerts to people who are wanting to do more. So great question there. Awesome. Well, we'll jump to the next slide, which is the many forms of disability. As Jay and I have hinted, there are in fact many forms of disability out there. And the way that they show up to people without disabilities has a big impact on how we're treated. For instance, like someone like Jay, Jay has a visible disability. The average 5-year-old, may be able to look at Jay and, realize she has a disability. It's the same as, anyone at any other age. And so what ends up happening for folks with visible disabilities is that, people are going to assume that they're not as capable of doing things as non-disabled people can. And so then the solution to that, problem is that non-disabled people will make choices for, people with visible disabilities. For instance, like if you're a wheelchair user and, you're just sitting there minding your own business, someone might suddenly grab your chair and start pushing it, assuming you're wanting to go somewhere without actually asking you. Happens all the time. I also can't, count the amount of times where Jay and I have been out in public or at disability conferences when someone walks up to us and asks, me questions about Jay, assuming she can't understand what's being said and assuming that she doesn't have any opinions about herself. And as anyone who's known Jay for more than 5 minutes can tell you, she's got a lot of opinions, especially about herself. And, her favorite thing to do in the world is, run over people with her wheelchair who do things like that. So what ends up happening is people are going to provide you supports, whether or not that's what you actually want. Another common form of disabilities out there are those of us, like me, with invisible disabilities, where you're not necessarily going to know that I'm autistic unless I tell you, or, unless I'm wearing a sassy shirt announcing the fact, which I often do. And so then what happens is whenever people are going to assume that I'm not disabled, therefore I don't need supports. I'm going to be able to do things in the same exact way at the same exact speed as the non-disabled people around me. So then there is pressure put on people like me to hide my disability for the comfort of the non-disabled people around me, to do things in a non-disabled way, no matter how much energy or no matter how painful it is for me. And whenever I ask for supports, oftentimes the assumption might be that I'm just trying to game the system. I'm trying to take advantage of, those supports out there for, those poor, disabled people like Jay over there, for instance, when in reality, I'm just trying to be at the same level, the same playing field as everyone else. My disabilities are valid. And, oftentimes since my experience with a disability is invisible, people don't realize, people don't know what's going on over here. Another really common difference I want to point out is, oftentimes disability can affect you in different ways throughout, throughout the day or throughout the week. Like for me, like the way my autism impacts me is going to be different, Monday versus Friday, because like I spend a lot of energy, like, focusing, sending emails, doing presentations like that, to the point where like usually at the end of the week, I just don't have as much energy left to like, appear non-autistic when needed. It's a lot harder for me to send emails or focus. And it's similar for folks with like chronic illnesses where, like one day they might be fine, like they couldn't walk like unaided. Another day they might need to like use a wheelchair. They might not be able to walk because of the high amount of pain. And folks will often assume that, they're just taking advantage of, things out there. They don't actually need the supports. They're just doing this for attention. And that's not oftentimes the case. Another really important thing I want to point out is like disability is pretty much the only like minority group that exists out there, the marginalized minority group, where you can suddenly and unexpectedly join either for a temporary or permanent basis. Like if you break a leg or, acquire a permanent disability like a brain injury or something like that. It's also one of the few marginalized groups where like, I would say probably the only other one is like the queer community, where like parents aren't necessarily going to share the same disabled identities as their kids will. And so that often leads to parents making decisions about, their kid with a disability related to their disability, using the lens of like, what they think of as is a good life, but not necessarily realizing that like when you have a disability, you gotta, it's going to be different. Yeah, so I've just said a lot of words there. Do folks have any questions about any of this? Doesn't seem like it. Cool. Well, then let's jump to the next slide. So, one of the most common questions we get is, what are the best words, we should use to talk about disability and people with disabilities? And, as someone with a lot of thoughts, I know Jay also has a lot of thoughts on this. So take it away, Jay.
There are not right ways to talk about disability, which might not be what we wanted to hear, but there are a few things that you should be aware. Considering about first language versus identity first language is important when talking to people with disabilities. People's first language emphasizes the person, not the disability. By placing the person first, the disability is no longer the primary defining characteristic of an individual, but one of several aspects of the whole person. For example, person with autism or a person with cerebral palsy. On the other hand, people who prefer identity first language for themselves often argue that their disability is an important part of who they are. For example, they are autistic or they are disabled. They are proud of their disability. This is a big deal in the autism community. As I have mentioned, there is not right way to talk about disability, but the most important consideration is whether you speak out of respect and recognition of the individual as a human being just a label. I think we should ask people with disabilities how they would like to be called, like when we ask people their preferred pronoun. I do not know why we should not, because disabilities are part of their identity. For example, I describe myself as a person with a disability. Just listen to people and try to recognize how they identify themselves. If you are unsure of something, just ask the person. Most people would not mind of explaining, but ask yourself that if you really need to know about someone's condition or you are just curious. If you are helping the person, you should know, but you are just walking by, probably not. Also, using the R word to anyone is not appropriate, as we all know. When we call people by our words as offensive, We are reinforcing the concept that people with disabilities are not vulnerable, which is not true. They are all equally important and deserve to be treated like everyone else. There also are words that you should not use when you talk about people with disabilities. Diagnoses should not be used as insults or hyperbole. Words like psycho, high functioning, low functioning, or normal are not appropriate to refer to people with disabilities. Many parents say that their children are low functioning, which really means they are not good enough. Or medical providers often someone is too high functioning for them to receive the services. This is common in autism world. We really are rating them based on how they look or their abilities. These words do not really describe anything. How do I know what types of help does someone need when I am told if they are high functioning or low functioning? It does not tell me anything about that person. It is part because those rules change quickly and we should not use certain words all of a sudden. For example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5, DSM, used to say gayness was a disability, but they took it out. Who knows what they are going to say in future? For this section, I would like you to remember that it is okay to make mistakes, that we all do, but be aware of how you treat people with disabilities and correct yourself if you do. Move on and do not make the same mistake again.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. A lot of really important things there. I'll just reiterate probably the most important thing she said. So, we don't have too many hard and fast rules when it comes to, like terminology preferences with disability. Probably the first hard and fast one I have is like, if you're talking about a specific person and their specific disability, follow, the guidance of whatever they say on how they want their disability to be described, what words, and like when it's okay to discuss their disability and with who. The second one is when you're talking about a collective group of people with the same disability, use that disability community's preference. And Jay was talking about person first versus identity first earlier, and I'll expand on that a little. So like person first, I'd be called a person with autism. And the idea is that like, disability isn't a sole defining characteristic of who you are. There's so much more that we bring to the world than just our disability, and we shouldn't be seen solely through the lens of our disability. And the communities that prefer that are like folks with Down syndrome, people with cerebral palsy, people with intellectual disabilities. And even, I'll say again, like within all of those groups, there's going to be different preferences. So if you're talking about a specific person, use their preference. And then there's identity first. So I'd be called autistic. And the idea with identity first is, like disability really is a defining characteristic of who you are, similar to like your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. And it's like, if you have to, sort of like de-emphasize a very salient part of your identity to, be seen as a person, it's an idea, it's just reflective that like, there's still a lot of stigma around disability, and your disability shouldn't be seen as like a dehumanizing characteristic, as unfortunately it so often is. The communities that prefer identity first are, the autistic community. It's been our preference since like 1993. And we got that from the deaf community. The blind community is the same way as well. And then of course, there's going to be different preferences within all of those different groups. Finally, Jay was talking about the R word. So historically, like the word retarded, like, started as like a medical term that, is used to refer to what we now refer to as people with intellectual disabilities. It's since devolved into a slur that's used to demean the personhood of, essentially anyone who acts different than expected. Like it's a term I was called hundreds, if not thousands of times in school. Never really felt good to be called that. And we like to say at the ARC, as this image at the top left says, the new R word is respect. Ultimately, those of us with disabilities aren't often given the respect that we deserve as people, and that needs to happen before, for us to be fully included in the world. Yeah, so do folks have any questions on any of this? Okay, doesn't seem like it, but if they do, we will be happy to answer them. All right, so we've got about 30 minutes left, which means we are actually 1 minute ahead of schedule. This is very surprising for Jay and I. And so we're going to come to our favorite part of this presentation, which is the models of disability. So first, I know there's a lot of words, really scary, confusing words on here, like perceptions, expectations, demeaning, segregation, containment. The good news is we have, slides, trying to clear all of those, cool. The good news is we have slides that have, the same words, but with pictures attached to them to make it more easy to understand. The bad news is that Jay loves giving pop quizzes whenever she wants, and she might give a pop quiz about any of these slides in this presentation. So just, pay attention. So, the first model we're going to talk about is the moral model of disability. And Jay is going to tell us, whether or not it's moral and how moral it actually is. So take it away, Jay.
The moral model is the idea that a person's disability is a punishment from God or a higher power, likely because the individual or their parents have done something wrong. We are not saying any religion is bad, and this model varies across cultures. We find that some cultures strongly believe that disabilities, especially disabilities that impact the way a person's mind works, are caused by God because someone has committed a terrible sin. If you view disability as a punishment, then are you likely to feel proud about having a disability personally or in your family? Will you want others to know? You are more likely to hide the disability, less likely to see support, etc. when people live within the moral model. They find disability to be taboo, something they do not want to talk about. Disability is viewed either as a pity or tragedy or as something terribly undesirable. Under the moral model, people with disabilities are not considered full human beings. We see this in all sorts of ways, whether it be that the person is considered a child, regardless of their age, or the person is considered either asexual or overly sexual, despite behaving like another person their age. For example, people usually baby talk to me because they think I am a child. This makes me want to run over them with my wheelchair. They see my disability instead of seeing me as a person. We also see this model in the media when all of the bad guys in crime shows and horror movies are disfigured or have mental health conditions. For example, in the movie, Peter Pan, Captain Hook is disabled and he is evil. He looks like a widow and has no friends. On the other hand, Peter Pan is not disabled to save everyone like a hero. Everyone loves him. When people live within the moral model, people with disabilities suffer. This is what leads to segregation into things like institutions, grotesque experiments, torture, forced sterilization, etc. There certainly is not support offered for people with disabilities, and there is no consideration that a person with a disability could achieve anything in life. When we see professionals in the field, they tend to view their work as charity. If you work for people with disabilities, you are considered as the nicest person in the world.
Yeah, definitely a lot of thoughts about the moral model. It's, I would say, a good thing that we don't see it as often, as we used to in the United States. The moral model really exists when like disability is so stigmatized that just the idea of it existing is just so painful to accept. And as a result, what ends up happening is like people with disabilities are at best under this model, you know, hidden away in their family homes, out of sight, out of mind of the community at large. At worst, what happens is that we're just kicked out of society, either by just being left out in the wilderness or through, more lethal means and never given access to, to society, to relationships with other people. You do still see aspects of this model in the US, for instance, like when parents of children receive a like newly like unexpected diagnosis. Like there's oftentimes this like grieving process that happens, and it comes from the stigma, the guilt, the blame and shame that's aimed at them by like their family members or like community members, if like they're, say, their kid's autistic and having a meltdown at the grocery store, for example. My boss, or no, she's not my boss anymore, my director, who was formerly mentioned in this presentation, has an autistic kid. And when her kid was first diagnosed, she told us, the first thought that popped into her head is like, why does my kid have a disability? Is it because I bullied this girl in third grade? Is it because I ate too much vanilla ice cream? And so like this model is really, there's a lot of like blame, there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of shame, and it's all connected to the idea that like disability is a capital B bad thing. It's unnatural. It happens because of a curse or, a mistake someone made. And now that's why disability exists. So it automatically means like those of us with disabilities aren't going to be treated very well in this world or in society at large. So the next model of disabilities we're going to talk about is the capitalist model of disabilities, and it's very connected to the anti-capitalist politic and the 10 principles of disability justice. And it also wouldn't be a presentation by two social workers if one of us didn't rant about capitalism for at least 5 minutes. So Jay's going to take care of that for us, so people will think we're actual social workers and not faking it. So take it away, Jay.
Capitalism. Economic model views disability as a person's inability to participate in work. You are considered as high if you have a good quality job. If you do not work or have low pay jobs, you are at bottom of anyone else. It also evaluates how a disability affects an individual's productivity and the economic consequences for the individual, employer, and the state. Impairments like loss of earnings for and payment for assistance by the individual, lower profit margins for the employer, and state welfare payments. For example, I tried to get a job at an organization where I knew people who worked there, and they said they would think about my needs and email me back. Did I get email back? No, they never answered me back. Of course, they may have other reasons, but I think it was 90% because of my disability, trusting them hiring who have disabilities that affect them a little. As I have mentioned earlier, people with disabilities have higher high school dropout rates, and they are most likely to be homeless. They can receive services which makes it worse for people with disabilities, like supplemental security income and SSI. It forces people to live poor and not to have a good income. In Seattle, people cannot live with what the SSI provides them monthly. Many people are afraid that they will lose the SSI and Medicaid when they get a job because they still need to pay their medical bills. In some ways, these services more push people with disabilities off of cliffs. Also, have anyone heard about public charge? There was a law around it, but in fall of 2018, the law that people of color who depend on federal money, they cannot become U.S. citizens. They are considered as too much of a burden. This affects people with disabilities because they need long-term health care services. Basically, you cannot become a U.S. citizen if you have a disability because you cost too much. You see this model in special education systems where the school does not fund special education. They see students with disabilities as burdens and not worth to put the money into them, which is not true.
Yeah, so this model definitely have a lot of thoughts. Jay's pretty much said all of them. But while the moral model really wouldn't provide any supports or allow for the existence of people with disabilities, this one will, but for very few people with disabilities. We will get supports. All of those supports are designed to make us more productive citizens. And it won't do anything to, say, develop our leisure skills, help us form more meaningful friendships or just find happiness out there in the world. And I think that happens because, in this model, disability only exists when someone, someone isn't able to produce or do things as efficiently as all the other people around them, whether that be because of a disability or maybe they speak English as a second language or, for whatever other reason. So this model also fails to consider things like, how does discrimination or ableism contribute to making someone, quote unquote, less productive? And that's something it shares in common with the next model as well. In this model, I'd say the biggest problem is that, as human beings, we're worth so much more than what we produce for the economy. We have hopes, we have dreams, we have desires, and that's not seen as valuable in this model. Your disability is looked at as a cost to society, as you see, for instance, this ad over here, hey, the cost of autism on the US economy this year is 162 to $367 billion. Well, as a social worker who's paid like a social worker, I'd like to see some of that, money sent my way if we're costing society that much. Where can I get that payout? That sounds pretty great. I'd say another thing about this model is while we can get supports, oftentimes it's only done based on whether or not it's ever, people will think we're ever able to be productive citizens. Early on, a decision is made in our life in the public school system, by special education staff, whether or not we'll actually ever be productive. And if we are, then sure, we'll get placed in the mainstream classrooms with in-classroom supports. If not, then we'll be placed in desegregated, self-contained classrooms away from, the non-disabled students, away from the majority of folks, and not really given access to, folks like that. And it just leads to, just a lack of access to the world or society. Constance said, the label high functioning must translate to being more economically productive than people who are considered, quote, low functioning. Is that the origin of those labels? I think that's a great question. I think that does play a part in it. I've always thought of it as how disabled does this person seem? For autistic folks, we're usually assumed to be high functioning if the average, person in a coffee shop won't be able to tell if we're autistic or not just by looking at us. But of course, the big problem with those labels, as Jay mentioned earlier, is it doesn't actually show what kind of supports we really need. It's just based on the perceptions of non-disabled people. And it doesn't consider the struggle that, the quote unquote high functioning people have in terms of masking or hiding, our disabilities. And it often doesn't consider that hey, a lot of quote unquote low functioning people, could absolutely be working really high paying jobs at Microsoft, if they have the right supports. One of my friends who's autistic, can't speak with his mouth parts, but, has a IQ much higher than mine. But, the average person wouldn't necessarily know it just by looking at him. And as a result, because of the lack of supports out there, in Washington State, a lot of folks like him are just not given the supports and like, essentially left to rot out by themselves. Jay said, if you design things for everything in the first place, it costs less. Yes, absolutely. Universal design is what she's talking about there. And we'll talk about in the social model of disability, but it does absolutely like relevant with the capitalist model as well. So I am known to rant about the capitalist model for very long amounts of time. So we'll save y'all from that by going to the other model that I absolutely can rant about for a long period of time, which is the medical model. It's probably the one that like the majority of folks here are going to be familiar with. The medical model sees like disability as, very similar to like a disease. And before I like rant about like the, medical system at what's been described to me as like, a year past, like when the pandemic ended, like, which I don't know if that's true or not. Like, if I need like, if I've got something like COVID, cancer, diabetes, broken arm, leg, yada, 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 like I'm absolutely going to need like doctors with fancy degrees, fancy educations, fancy letters after their names to prescribe or remove the presence of those conditions within me, because like those conditions could absolutely kill me or harm me if left untreated. And, the big problem with the medical model is that it will treat those disabilities, lifelong disabilities that can't be cured, can't be removed, and in a lot of ways shouldn't be, cured or removed. It still tries to do that. And if it can't, then it just teaches us to like hide our disabilities, to be more independent. And while like, sure, in some cases, like hiding our disabilities can be useful, like if we're being stopped by the police or like having to interview at a job, like, sure, it's a useful survival school, but it's not the be all end all ideal of success. And one thing that's often been said in the autism world is like, success means being indistinguishable from our peers, which was really popular, even 5 years ago. What we now know for the research is like the biggest predictor of suicidal ideation in autistic people is how much energy we're spending masking, also known as like hiding our autistic traits, like making eye contact, talking in a socially appropriate tone of voice, talking about socially appropriate things, quote unquote, like the weather or sports. I hear there was a big like sports game that happened yesterday that people around here are pretty upset about, for instance. And what ultimately ends up happening is like we're taught just to put other people's needs above our own. We're taught that like, when we're forming friendships, it's going to be in a way that is, that non-autistic people do it. And we don't, for instance, get the same like brain-based dopamine reward that non-autistic people get when they're around their like favorite friends and family members. We as autistic people only get it when we're doing our favorite activities. So we're taught that like, feeling empty, not feeling good from, your relationships with other people is the default. It's the way everyone lives life. And that just leads to a lot of depression and anxiety. The other thing is like, as I mentioned earlier, like independence is seen as the be all end all goal for people with disabilities. And while not having to depend on, the people around you to be able to access society, like sure it is, I would say it is a good idea in a lot of ways. One thing my my non-speaking autistic friend I mentioned earlier once said is like, independence should not come at the cost of pain. And it's like similar to masking what I was just talking about. Like if the expectation is like the person with the disability has to show up in a way that's painful, for us, so that non-disabled people aren't, essentially like quote unquote burdened by our existence, or they don't have to consider our accessibility needs when like building a building, for instance, then ultimately it just leaves everyone out. It harms everyone. It prevents people with disabilities from having like good, authentic relationships with our friends and family members and society at large. Um, Kayla said in chat, I've never seen that Seattle Children's graphic before. Wow, that's disappointing. Yeah, so this was like a legit bus ad that like the Seattle Children's Research Institute put out about, I think it was 2014, 2015. It was people were, I would say, motivated enough by this graphic to send some very stern but politely worded letters, and many that were not politely worded, to the Seattle Children's leadership, asking them why they thought this was a good idea and asking them to remove the bus ads, which they did in about a week, which I will just say is very impressive speeds for the leadership over at Seattle Children's. Jay wrote in chat, we all need support. For example, you depend on your phone every day for everything. Yeah, and there's nothing shameful about that, for sure. It definitely helps me, avoid paying attention to presentations whenever Jay is involved. It's great. Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll say on this model is like, it only looks at disability as existing within the person, and it fails to consider like, how does the environment around us also contribute to disabling us, to impairing us. And the social model is a model that does a great job of looking at that. And it's the model we really aspire to see more of at the Arc of King County. What I really like that it does is it divides disability into two different categorizations. First, there's impairments which exist within the person. That might be like where you need to use a wheelchair to get around. You're not able to walk on your 2 feet. Or maybe you're blind, something like that. And then it also looks at like, what are the conditions around you, the social or physical environments that are contribute to disabling you. So for instance, we've got a person down here in this photo sitting at a slot, a sign that says, weigh in, everyone welcome. And there's just a big flight of stairs without any like ramps or elevators. Jay, does this look familiar to you? It kind of looks like the UW campus when you were trying to go there, right? Yeah. So it's just a reminder that like, as much as like, we need supports for the specific aspects within ourselves that contribute to disabling us, the world around us also has to be like meeting us like halfway by building ramps or elevators. And just imagine like, if this was your apartment building, you couldn't get into your apartment, like that's going to be pretty painful every day. You're going to need to depend on someone to, I guess, carry you up the stairs. And that shouldn't be that way. Like, architects should absolutely be considering accessibility from the get-go. And I think the other really great thing about this model is that it, looks at like, how does the existence of people with disabilities ultimately enrich in the world around us, enrich in the lives and experiences around us. Yeah, Jay says, good excuse to skip a class, lol. Or like, also like when, UW expected you to like take your own notes and couldn't understand like why you would need a note taker with you during class. Yeah, that was peak comedy right there for sure. Where was I? Oh yeah, so for instance, like without deaf people, we wouldn't have text messaging. And now, in addition to helping deaf people and autistic people around the world avoid making phone calls, it now helps, school children avoid listening to their teachers give lectures on, medieval European history and the Byzantine Empire and all that. Now, in addition to helping like people with wheelchairs or physical disabilities access buildings, like automatic door openers will also help mothers carrying like 10 babies on one arm and 11 bags of groceries on the other arm. It's great for everyone involved. Like without autistic people, we probably wouldn't have sci-fi. And so these are just like some of the small ways that like the existence of people with disabilities has really enriched the world and made it a much better place for everyone around. Yeah. So before we jump to the next slide, I'm just going to copy and chat a survey we would really appreciate having y'all fill out. We want to make sure all our presentations are doing right by the people in the audience. And so if you have a chance to take that survey, it's like 5 minutes at most, just give us feedback on like, how can we do better in the future? That would be really awesome. That way we can make sure we're doing right by everyone we're presenting to. So the final model of disability is the inspiration model. And sometimes just the idea of wanting to center people with disabilities can go a little too far. And Jay, I'm actually wondering, do you want to present on this, or should we do the Stella Young video? Stella, do you want to do Stella Young? Cool. All right, everyone, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So give me a quick moment while I pull up Stella Young's TED Talk. She is a much better speaker than both Jay and I, and y'all are, we're very happy that y'all will have a chance to listen to Stella Young speak. There's also an advertisement happening right now, so I'm saving y'all from that. Okay, go ahead. Okay, cool. Advertisement is done. Let me optimize for video clip, share sound. Great. Okay, this is good. Let me pull that up.
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It was all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah. And they were right, I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right, I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, and I was about 20 minutes into a Year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey, miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, like your motivational speaking. When people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say, like, inspirational stuff. Yeah. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. For lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire. And in fact, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you dramatically. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we have been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing. Capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing. And to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't make you exceptional. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You may have seen images like this one. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one. Your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one. Before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You might have seen the one, the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fibre prosthetic legs. And these images, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But what if you are that person? I've lost count of the number of times that I've been approached by strangers wanting to tell me that they think I'm brave or inspirational. And this was long before my work had any kind of public profile. They were just kind of congratulating me for managing to get up in the morning and remember my own name. And it is objectifying. These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. They are there so that you can look at them and think that things aren't so bad for you, to put your worries into perspective. And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things, but the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnoses. So I've lived in this body a long time. I'm quite fond of it. It does the things that I need it to do, and I've learnt to use it to the best of its capacity, just as you have. And that's the thing about those kids in those pictures as well. They're not doing anything out of the ordinary. They are just using their bodies to the best of their capacity. So is it really fair to objectify them in the way that we do, to share those images? People, when they say, you're an inspiration, they mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a compliment. And I know why it happens. It's because of the lie. It's because we've been sold this lie that disability makes you exceptional. And it honestly doesn't. And I know what you're thinking. I'm up here bagging out inspiration. You're thinking, geez, Stella, aren't you inspired sometimes by some things? And the thing is, I am. I learn from other disabled people all the time. I'm learning not that I'm luckier than them, though. I am learning that it's a genius idea to use a pair of barbecue tongs to pick up things that you drop. I'm learning that nifty trick where you can charge your mobile phone battery from your chair battery. Genius. We are learning from each other strength and endurance, not against our bodies and our diagnoses, but against a world that exceptionalizes and objectifies us. I really think that this lie that we've been sold about disability is the greatest injustice. It makes life hard for us. And that quote, "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," the reason that that's bullshit is because it's just not true. Because of the social model of disability, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a rap. Never. Smiling at a television screen isn't going to make closed captions appear for people who are deaf. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshop and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I really want to live in a world where disability is not the exception but the norm. I want to live in a world where a 15-year-old girl sitting in her bedroom watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer isn't referred to as achieving anything because she's doing it sitting down. I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. I want to live in a world where we value genuine achievement for disabled people. And I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, always a fan of that video. I think it's Stella Young was such an amazing speaker. And she does a really great job of just talking about how the low expectations we have of people with disabilities ultimately leads to circumstances where we're not included in real or meaningful ways. So let me, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, we're at 8:31. So do folks have any last minute questions before we end the presentation? Doesn't seem like it. Well, thank you all so much for sitting here listening to us for the past hour and a half. We really hope it was a good experience for y'all. And, if you want this or similar presentations to happen more often, feel free to reach out to Jay or I. Because of a grant from King County, we are able to offer trainings like this for free to nonprofits or governmental entities who serve people in King County. So please feel free to reach out. Awesome. Well, I hope y'all have a great night.
Zach and Jay, thank you both so much. And this is just the beginning. This is a conversation we're going to be having through this year. So you have kicked it off perfectly. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Constance. Have a great night, everyone.